Hey, this is Jeff, the Souring Gentleman. It's been a while since I've recorded a podcast, and I've tried recording this one several times. There's a lot of content to get through here, and so you throw in a little bit of my perfectionism, and I'm no closer to a finished product than I was when I was born. So I think I'm going to record this one more time, and what you see is what you get. And that's that. Part of the reason I haven't recorded a third podcast yet is because there's a little bit of that imposter syndrome. Like, who the hell am I? Why would anyone care what I have to say? And realistically, the world would be fine without one of my podcasts. But the fact is, I'm not even doing this for any other reason than to try to communicate. I've always had it kind of weighing down on me that I have things that I need to communicate. And I've tried it through music, through visual arts, photography. I've tried in several different ways. I've written a book. It made it as far as the editor, and I did not go through and revise for a second draft because I had kind of lost interest in it. And, it never made it out. It never made it anywhere, really. This podcast is kind of the same kind of project. I do see it going longer term. But as far as just from a communication standpoint, when I record with my buddy Jim on his podcast called The Garden, I kind of get this out of my system, and I don't feel the pull or the drive to create another podcast. So I went and recorded at his place. I think we've got 3 or 4 episodes in the pipeline that I need to work on to get them ready to release. And as a result, I feel less of a drive because that communication is kind of making its way out. At any rate, the reason I'm making a podcast right now is because I was considering how every election is a response to something. You're either happy with how things are going or you're not. You're either voting for a change or you're voting for things to stay the same. And I was thinking about this when I was considering our political environment in general, because Biden was very much a response to Trump. Biden did not run on any policy that would anchor his campaign. All he was campaigning on was, I'm not Trump. And he was campaigning on social justice, which both of those things kind of boil down the same way into social justice. But was Trump just a response to Obama? Was it really just as simple as politics in response to color? And it's very easy to blame Trump and his slights against minorities by just making a blanket statement about race and bigots and calling it good. But such a simplistic idea doesn't really get us anywhere. Because while there was a part of that, I think the Tower of Babel is more likely the case. We do have a right-left division in the United States, but not where we're told that division is. It's not as much a right-left issue as much as it's just a language barrier. We have antecedent events that require close inspection if we ever hope to fix our country before we spiral into demise at our own hands by way of like a new civil war. And we really are mostly saying the same things. We were, at least until around 2015 when Trump started frothing up his masses. Until that point, we mostly wanted the same things. But we take that aggregate messaging and we hear a minor point like a shibboleth that coarsens debate, and then all bets are off. Then it's all about grab the pitchforks. But if you can think back to 2009 with the Tea Party movement, it started in February of 2009 when CNBC reporter Rick Santelli, while he was on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, he called for a Tea Party. And so this Tea Party was a legit grassroots organization that was pulled mostly from hard-right Republicans who stood for a significant reduction in the size and scope of government and limiting the size of the federal government and reducing government spending, lowering the national debt, and opposing tax increases. The biggest reason for the Tea Party, though, was because we were trying to recover from a recession while we were all being victimized by the housing market and the banks and predatory lending. Like, I had purchased a home in 2006 I was a first-time home buyer and I didn't know any better, so I went with an adjustable interest rate. I was told that I could refinance after a couple of years and I could take advantage of lower interest rates that would surely be available if I'd made all my payments on time. So I had bought my home for $120,000 in our small town where real estate never really saw much of an immediate increase. And we'd seen a little bump over the previous several years, but nothing like what was going on in Seattle and California. So we purchased the house for $120,000 and we made all our payments on time, and they were around $600 or something. I don't remember exactly. But right after the housing market bubble had popped, it was time to refinance. We had someone come in and praise the house to do our refinancing, and we were told that our home was now worth $53,000, which was half of what we owed. We were told there was no way to refinance because we had so much negative equity in the home, and we were stuck with the new adjusted rate. I don't remember what the rate had increased to, but we were now paying over $1,400 per month on a 30-year fixed for a home that was worth $53,000. So in total, we would have paid somewhere around $504,000 for a home worth $53,000. This was the most I'd ever paid in rent or mortgage up to that point. And it doesn't sound like a lot now, but this was in 2009, and I was working at the Home Depot. I didn't make nearly enough to cover an $800 bump in mortgage for a home that was now worth half of what I owed. So I made the payments until I couldn't afford it anymore. And after talking to a banker and a lawyer that I knew, I was advised just to let the house go. I eventually had to stop making the payments, and it still took 5 years for the bank to take the house back. Like, they were so backed up from screwing so many people out of their homes that it took them years just to put a lock on it and a sign saying they were taking it. This was the real reason for the Tea Party movement. It was a call for a separation of bank and state. And this, too, was the exact reason for the Occupy Wall Street movement. Back then, both sides were saying the same thing. They were speaking different languages, but saying the same thing. And there was the division from like Fox News and CNN and Glenn Beck, Michael Savage. We all wanted the outcome to be basically the same. We wanted accountability in a system that was allowing these billionaires to get their bailouts while we, the people, were being fucked over. And what did we get? We got more division. We got the Tea Party movement speaking out and being led by the snouts and speaking out against the Occupy movement. We got the Occupy movement inflamed by CNN speaking out against the Tea Party movement. These two movements were the most extreme we would see for several years. It wouldn't be until 2016 that this division would become exceedingly symptomatic. But this wasn't what initially divided us. This was a symptom of a major problem we have in the United States. We have oligarchs, billionaires that keep making billions. And they literally take the money from us through our tax money and give it to the wealthiest groups in the history of Earth. And what do the billionaires do with this money? Well, they no doubt incentivize their employees by paying them more and giving them better benefits, causing a spark in a weary economy, right? No, they lay off hundreds or thousands of employees. They take their billions of dollars in bailouts, and then they buy stock in their own companies, bolstering the market. So now they've taken billions of dollars from the same people who are now jobless, and they've given their money to the wealthiest corporations in history. The Occupy and the Tea Party movements were saying the same thing. They were saying, stop this. But as I mentioned, they didn't stop, and they've done it again and again. They do it with every tax cut. They do it with every stimulus package. Billionaires can use their private jets as tax deductions, but when a teacher buys pencils and Kleenex for her class because of the underfunding in our education system, that teacher can't deduct those from their taxes. And this was thanks to Trump's tax plan, taking from regular people and giving it to the rich. And yes, I can hear you. Yes, we got tax cuts under Trump too, but those cuts are less and less each year until we're finally paying more in taxes to cover the borrowed amount. But the wealthy, they get to keep their tax cuts. Ours go up to pay back that borrowed money. So not only did they give them our money at the time, but they borrowed against our futures and gave them that as well. And that was in the plan. That was Trump's tax plan to fuck over the average person and give that money to the rich. That's not even speaking to the 2 COVID stimulus packages that Trump put through that did the exact same thing the government had done in 2008 for the 2008 housing crisis. And it's done exactly the same in his tax plan. We, the American people, will pay back those stimulus packages, not the corporations who used that money to fire their employees because it's more profitable to cut them and buy stocks in their own companies. They keep that. And labor is the easiest expense to control, so it's much easier to just tell Bob, sorry, Bob, you're not going to work for the next 2 weeks. It's easier to do that than it is to go through the manufacturing process and hone your manufacturing process to save a few bucks on the back end. No, we, the people, to form a more perfect union, will be paying back that stimulus money. We get it through layoffs. We get it through the stimulus. We get it through our taxes. How many people can fuck you at once? And the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill that Biden put through wasn't exclusively good either. I didn't vote for Biden, and the only way that I would in the future is if he runs again and he's facing Trump or DeSantis. Those are the 2 people who are edging us closer and closer to losing our democracy. They are not the only 2, but those are the worst offenders right now. In fact, and this is really the point of this podcast, but in January of 2021, our democracy failed. We're no longer considered the world's oldest democracy. We are now classified as an anocracy, and that means we're not fully democratic and we're not fully autocratic. It's basically a hybrid of the 2. An organization called the Center for Systemic Peace has been using something called the polity data set, which has been used since the 1960s in political science research. And this data set establishes whether a country is a democracy, autocracy, or somewhere in the middle. They use a scale from -10 to +10 when they're doing their ratings. And they found that we dropped below the democracy threshold in 2020. Now, these studies are conducted with funding provided from the CIA, who uses these data sets to help predict political instability in foreign countries. So, what dropped our polity score in 2020? Well, in 2019, the CSP lowered the USA code for executive constraints from 7 to 6 because of the executive's or the president's systematic rejection of congressional oversight. In 2020, the coding for executive constraints fell again due to the executive's systematic purge of disloyalists from the administration through a forceful response to protests. Trump had asked, why can't we just shoot protesters in the legs? You might remember. Our score dropped because of vilification of the main opposition parties and undermining public trust in the electoral process. All of this reduced the USA polity score in 2020 to an anocracy. And as I said before, the Trump presidency had real consequences. I never thought it would be the end of our democracy, but here we are letting it slip away. And with Biden in the White House, we may be looking to reemerge into a democratic system. But if Trump or DeSantis or someone similarly unhinged were to win the White House in 2024, I think the destruction of our democracy really is imminent. Barbara Walter is not Barbara Walters, but Barbara Walter is an American political scientist and a professor at the University of California. And Walter has been studying civil wars for the last 30 years. Over the last 4 years, she's been on a task force for the CIA that tries to predict when and where political violence, instability, and civil war is likely to break out. And she claims the 2 best predictors for the likelihood of political violence is whether the country is an anocracy, which we are, and whether ethnic entrepreneurs have emerged, using racial, religious, or ethnic divisions to try to gain political power, which we also have. This isn't some obscure group of people that you may picture when you think of the term ethnic entrepreneurs, but that just speaks to identity politics, which is screaming along at a fevered pitch these days. I may post a link to a podcast that my buddy Jim and I had done that covered identity politics, but these two predictors, according to Walter, have shown themselves at a surprisingly fast rate here in the US. It needs to be made clear that these are not intuitions that someone conducting a study would intuit and then interpret for a broader audience to see how that information metabolizes in a test group. These are CIA data sets and metrics that are used to calculate and reliably predict coups and instability in foreign governments. And now they're predicting this for the US. This should be concerning no matter where you fall politically. The only thing really saving us from full-on autocracy was Mike Pence, of all people. The peaceful exchange of power in January 2021 is what saved us from a dictatorship. And people don't understand how precariously positioned we are right now. There are a lot of reasons to hate Mike Pence, but there was a violent mob that came within 40 feet of him when they were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" after they had erected gallows outside. And Pence was being hurried to his motorcade, and when they finally got to the garage, he refused to get in the car. That motorcade that would have provided propaganda for the opposition forces for years, the view of Mike Pence fleeing a hostile takeover of the government would have literally been the end of what was left of our democracy. And as much as I can say about Mike Pence, and as many bad things as I do have to say about him, it cannot be understated just how kindly history will look back on him. That is, if we can prevent ourselves from losing the rest of what we have. It was estimated that our democracy would fall by 2030 and that we would live under a dictatorship. Many of those predictions have been bumped to 2024 because it's difficult to picture Biden winning another election if he runs again. And if that is the case, then history would see Mike Pence as the one man who fought off a totalitarian regime and who bought us a little extra time when we were just going to throw it all away anyway. But a foreign government that gets to the point where we find ourselves now are put on a CIA watch list for being at high risk for civil war. This is not just about making some shitty comments about the LGBTQ+ movement. We're at risk for actual civil war. Our democracy is not safe. We are not a strong democracy. We've been declining on every measure over the last 5 years. This isn't a newer development. A journalist named Stephen Marsh has been warning about conflict for years. And his claim is that even if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, we would still be on the verge of domestic conflict. When he's doing his analysis of our ethnic entrepreneurs, he's seeing this as more about fanaticism in general and not just necessarily for Trump. So what would a new American Civil War look like? And when people think about a new American Civil War, they have a difficult time conceptualizing what that might look like. And so the knee-jerk reaction is to dismiss it on its face. But it wouldn't be two separate armies with different uniforms meeting up to shoot each other in a field. If civil war had broken out, for instance, because of the 2020 election, and Biden had found his way into the White House, we would have seen the MAGA crowd mounting attacks against anyone to the left of them. They would start with the politicians in Washington, and this would have resulted in martial law. We would have seen military in the streets of Washington, D.C., and sooner than later, there would have been attacks against state legislators. And this would prompt curfews, and anything our military forces would do against combatants would be used as propaganda and as a recruiting device, which would embolden opposition forces. So if Trump coups had worked, we would have seen a resistance rise from people on the left. And there would have been several people from the left waging attacks on federal legislators, and the end result would have been very much the same. Just different group of people opposing the U.S. military through guerrilla warfare. And these events would be a lot like what we saw in Ireland during the Troubles. So what civil war would look like for us, there would probably be several factions like terrorist cells that would use guerrilla tactics to plant explosives like car bombs or package bombs in different places. And the lines that are drawn between enemy forces would not be clearly defined. I've been interested in the Irish resistance to Great Britain's military forces for a few years now. And looking at the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, their attacks were carried out by people who were leading a resistance to forces in Northern Ireland. But it wasn't just attacks against what they would see as enemy combatants. They would also attack anyone who appeared to support British forces. So if you were seen to be a sympathizer, you were a target. If you were hanging out at a pub where sympathizers had been seen, there was a risk that that pub could be hit with a car bomb out front or a package bomb left at the entrance. And during the Troubles, what we saw was a little more cleanly defined line of forces that were drawn according to religious affiliation. So yes, it was those who were in support of or against the British military, but it was also a Catholic versus Protestant line that was drawn. And this Catholic versus Protestant line is the identity politics that Walter talks about in her book. And the way that's manifesting in the US today is through culture wars. You only have to watch Fox News for about 2 minutes to hear them use the term woke left. And I'm not exactly sure if I'm remembering this correctly, and I should have looked it up beforehand, but I believe as a part of the Good Friday Agreement, what was originally considered to be terrorist attacks were now seen as tactics of war. And as a result of the signing of the agreement, they released several people who had been held on charges of terrorism, and many of the people either convicted of these crimes or suspects of the bombings found their way into politics in Ireland. So these terrorists not only were released from prison, but they are now helping to legislate in Ireland. As I said about religious affiliation taking so much of a hold against the woke left, in South Carolina, in the Republican primaries, the person who came in second place for the 4th congressional seat in that state with almost 24% of the vote was Pastor Mark Burns. And Burns said on the campaign trail that we should execute people in the LGBTQ+ movement and their advocates for treason. This motherfucker got 24% of the vote in the primary. This dude was endorsed by Trump. He was on Air Force One with Trump. They were on the campaign trail together for a short time. And the newsworthy bits of this aren't that someone who said these things came in second place. It's the fact that anyone could say these things publicly and not be turned into a laughingstock the very next day. He was serious, and people took him seriously. And 24% of those people thought it was a good idea. Now, you can see me as an alarmist, but this shit is alarming. And he's not alone. This kind of thing is being said over and over again. The people on the right say stop forcing your agenda down our throats, while at the same time calling for legislation like the Don't Say Gay bill. They accuse those people in the LGBTQ movement of indoctrinating or grooming kids while simultaneously trying to stop schools from teaching evolution. And if you think these are secular ideas, this is being parroted from the fucking pulpit. They're acting as though they own us. And the right is more than pleased with this if it's in alignment with their religious ideology. But what they don't consider is that they're violating the First Amendment. The only way to legislate against the LGBTQ movement is by invoking your religion, because there is nothing inherently wrong with it. You cannot have the First Amendment and the First Commandment coexist. They are ideas in opposition to one another. And this is where the real danger lies, because Trump, for whatever reason, was embraced by the evangelical Christians. And it's mostly because he's speaking out against the different groups that the evangelicals already despise, which is the LGBTQ movement. And I would argue that the Bible doesn't even talk about consensual homosexuality. When it says a man shall not lie with another man as he lies with a woman, that's in a list of everyone else that he cannot have sex with, like his sister-in-law, his aunt, his mother, like someone else's wife. These are adulterous conceptions. These are not rules for consenting homosexuals. And then in Sodom and Gomorrah, it's about hospitality. It's not about homosexuality, as they always claim. But as far as Trump goes, the evangelicals can say, well, sure, he's been divorced, he's cheated, he says he can just walk up and grab a woman by the pussy, but that's all necessitated by his bravado, which we embrace in moderation. It's just going a little further than good taste would allow. And so you hear him say, well, I'm for Trump. Yeah, I don't like some of the things he says, but I support Trump. But he got his hooks in by preaching borders, language, and culture. And that is an idea that they're in love with because of their tribalism, their inherent tribalism that comes from their religion. Once the evangelicals see you as a part of their tribe, and once the hate preachers start receiving prophecies about you, prophets like, that's quote unquote prophets like Johnny Enlow, Robin Bullock, Kat Kerr, Kent Christmas, Greg, this list goes on and on. And people I'll be highlighting on this channel, no doubt, once these people start with the prophecies, anyone who says anything against Trump is no longer just speaking against Trump, but they're speaking against God. And this is the mechanism that has allowed for the personality cult of Trump. So now what used to be civil disagreements quickly evolves into a holy war and a border war and a language and culture war. And everything the left does to live according to their principles, that becomes principally against the right and principally against their religion. Every disagreement becomes a part of the culture war. If the left is in support of anything the right deems questionable, that is a new wedge that is used to separate the sides as an anti-religious doctrine of the left and of the woke crowd. And so everything that is woke becomes a wedge of division. And so what started as a Tea Party and the Occupy movements and what used to be a Tower of Babel problem, using different cultural languages to describe the same problem, has become an identity politics problem. We used to believe in American solidarity and tenacity and ingenuity, and we got this firmly implanted in our culture in 2001. And then once the war on terror became a clusterfuck under George Bush, those divisions kind of started to implant themselves once again. So not everything is cleanly divided down a religious line for me. I know it sounds like it, and I can already hear some people saying that I'm just critical of religion and I'm hypersensitive to religion anywhere near politics. And that may be somewhat true, but I'm not exclusively critical of these people just because of their religion. This is what happens when you allow too much of your religion to inform your political opinions. And religion just happens to be one of the things adherents find defense-worthy. And just as with the rest of identity politics, these are the things worth fighting over. And some of the preachers, like Mark Burns, who I mentioned earlier, think people from the LGBTQ movement should be put to death. They think the government should execute these people and anyone who advocates for them. How is it that this is not being seen as a hate group in its entirety? The entirety of evangelical Christians, in my opinion, should be seen as a hate group.